that brief definition of faith. Do you remember it? Some of us do, some of us don't. What is faith? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It is the conviction of things unseen. And for people who like definitions, that will be helpful. But now we're going to start with what the major part of chapter 11 is really about. Looking at people of faith, people who have embodied this in all sorts of different ways, so that we can learn something about the texture of faith, the shape of it, how it feels, how it's lived, how it's known actually by people in some ways like ourselves. And we start with that, as the scriptures start, by going right back to the very beginning of the story of humanity, the story of faith, back into that sort of foggy and vague bit of almost like prehistory. The history of faith, in many respects, starts with Abraham, doesn't it? It's very clear there. But we get back to this very sort of nebulous bit, this foggy bit, between Eve and Adam, Abel and Cain, as briefly mentioned in the passage we read, where there is a refusal of God. God who comes and God who's refused. And then between that and then the story of Noah, in which there is a reckoning for that refusal, for life lived with that refusal and what that looks like. And in that space between the two, in Hebrews, only one name, only one person is singled out. There aren't many names that could be singled out, but one is singled out, and that's Enoch. Now, you might not know much about Enoch, but we're told that Enoch pleased God because of his faith, believing that God exists and rewards those who seek God. To tell the truth, we don't have much to go on when we look back at Enoch. He's a bigger character in the Jewish faith, although he doesn't appear anymore in the sort of canon of scriptures. But there are 3 apocryphal books written between the Old Testament and the New Testament that have his name. Imaginatively, they're called 1st Enoch, 2nd Enoch, and 3rd Enoch. And they're attributed to Enoch. They were written much, much later. And in actual fact, they've had their own bits and bobs of influence on many of us, and things we believe, the stories we're familiar with at least. Stuff like the fall of angels into demons, a bit more about the flood. But in actual fact, in the scriptures, there's not very much about him. I'm going to read it to us. It comes up in Genesis 5. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after the birth of Methuselah for 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. That's it, but it is at least intriguing, isn't it? The numbers and the experience. But this ancient text itself does, apart from the intrigue of he was not, which we'll come to, and the big numbers, which we won't come to, because we don't know what that means. But what he has left, what has endured about that tiny little account, is this image, which is crucial for the life of faith, of walking with God. He walked with God for 300 and odd years. He walked with God. In Hebrews, remember, it says he pleased God. And in Genesis, it says he walked with God. And maybe really they're the same thing. To walk with God is to please God. We might ask, what is faith in Hebrews? And the first pin to put in for our understanding of faith, what is faith? It is a walk with God over a lifetime. That's good for us in many respects because we like a walk, don't we? Many of us don't like walking, that's fine. But we like a journey. I'm told this all the time. I turn on television. I was watching the Olympics. It's not good enough to know how fast they run anymore. You need to know the backstory. You need to know how hard it was for them to get there, what adversities they've overcome. I've been following the US Tennis Open. I haven't seen any of the images. I just follow it, reading about it because I find it intriguing. And I know the backstories of loads of the competitors. 2 of the female competitors were billionaires. And I just thought, oh, they must have had it easy in that case. I wasn't particularly interested in them. And then Jack Draper, the England, has anyone else followed it? I won't bore you all about it. Well done, Irene. Jack Draper, England number 1, got to the semi-finals and has had his own personal battle with a poor physique. I understood exactly what he meant. And with damaging senses of anxiety. He was sick on the court twice. What a story. What a journey he's had over the last few years. We like a journey. I'm told that if you watch Strictly, I'll get this little knowledgeable comment from Claire. If you watch Strictly and they say early on, this person knows how to dance, they're not going to win. Because there's just no journey. You want to know that they've got 2 left feet when they walk in the door and they're going to work their way through to be, whatever it is they are at the end when they get their 10s. We want a journey. Well, let's just say that the Bible got there first on this, as in many things. And this ancient wisdom pictures the life of faith as a journey, as a walk with God. In actual fact, a walk in God and a walk to God. But it starts with a walk with God. Some of us, of course, might not like the image straight away. Some of us will love it. Some of us love walking. And we get out and it means a lot to us. Some of us might struggle to get around, and this idea of a walk with God just feels like hard work. A tough thing. Immediately the question comes, will I keep up? Will I be able to do it? But those are right questions of being, if you like, stumbling along with God for many years now, often wondering if I'm walking right, if I'm keeping up. Did I turn off at some point? All of these questions come. So if we struggle with the image, then fair dues. I think the Bible is full of struggling with this image, but the image is there. And of course, we've been reminded in the Paralympics, spectacularly at times, that we all come at walking, running, swimming, archery, basketball, volleyball, rowing, all of these things. We all come at them differently, sometimes heroically. Sometimes super impressively. We all walk differently. And so we may come at what this walk with God feels like differently. But the image is there in Scripture. It's an image for the life of faith. And we are told that evidently Enoch did it well. He stuck with it over a lifetime. He walked with God. Now, of course, as soon as we say about his lifetime, we get this thing about the numbers. The numbers are big, aren't they, if you read that bit? And we just probably need to just banish that and say, we don't know what it means. Was it literal? Was it poetic? What's it in there for? We're not really sure. It's back in that foggy bit of history. So they're there, and we don't know what to do with that. But we are told that however long those 300 odd years really means, he walked with God. He did it all with God. And others have struggled. He did it well. But others have struggled. So it was no mean achievement. Because God has always sought to walk with us. And if you think back even further, just a couple of chapters, he's in chapter 5, go back to chapter 3. What happened when God came to walk with Eve and Adam in the garden? Do you remember? They hid. God came to walk, and they hid. Enoch walked with God. Adam and Eve hid from God. I think God also came to walk with Cain as well. Do you remember the story? The next chapter, chapter 4. We're told about a conversation that God had with Cain. Cain was living through a tough time. Life didn't seem fair. Properly, I don't think it was fair, really. And God was caught up in it all. How come his brother's life seemed so acceptable and so good, and his life just wasn't going right? God was implicated in this. It didn't seem fair, and God came to walk with Adam, and he said this, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? Why are you so crestfallen, Cain? Do what is good, and you will be lifted up." They're having a hard time, but he wouldn't walk with God. It's telling in that story there that he gives no response to that question. Why are you angry? Why are you so crestfallen? There is a silence. There is perhaps an embittered silence. He will not go there. He will not talk it through. And things go from bad to worse for Cain and for the others as we look through the story, as folk live out this refusal that had been modelled by Adam, by Eve, by Cain. Go on to the likes of Lamech. You can read the story in chapter 4 of Genesis. Until we get this brief mention of Enoch, and we're simply told he walked with God. God showed up, and Enoch made sure to walk in step with God. It became a way of life. You know, when we read the text that we read earlier in Micah, saying, what does God want from us? And there are these three components: to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. Very simple, life-changing requirements. And perhaps we wonder sometimes, oh, well, I can't do the walk because I just don't love mercy and I'm not doing justly. But I think we get this in Enoch, perhaps the suggestion that it goes the other way round. Do the walk. If you're struggling, say you're struggling. Bring it to church. Bring it to God. Admit it openly. But do the walk, always bring it to God. And then maybe those things come wrapped up in the walk. Something like that is going on, just a picture of him in his life walking with God. And I wonder if this is true for many of us, that walking is a time of deeper conversation. If you think about some of the important conversations that you've had in life, some of the important moments that you've had in life, often it happens out on walks. You know, when you're walking with somebody. It can happen when you're driving as well, side by side, because there's something of a similar dynamic as you're walking along. Because you're not looking directly at the person, just occasionally, eye to eye for a bit of confirmation. For the most part, side by side, and you see your companion out of the corner of your eye, aware of their presence as you take in other things. That's a really good image of the life of faith. Seeing God, but not directly, out of the corner of your eye. Aware of God's presence as you deal with other things. Occasionally stopping for this eye-to-eye moment. Occasionally being surprised by God, that you feel like there is this face-to-face moment. But for the most part, in a mirror dimly. And it's something like that this suggests. That kind of walk that Enoch did over a lifetime. Part of it, because of the context of Genesis, you think is to do with hearing these questions and giving space and time to them. God comes walking in the garden, in our lives, bringing some questions. One of the questions, the first question ever was that, where are you? Where are you? Next question, where is your brother? Actually, one before that, why are you angry? These kind of prodding questions. How are things going? How is life? I've said to you before, and when I was growing up, my gran was a wonderful woman, a bit scary, but a wonderful woman, would come and visit once a year. And I knew that at some point she would sit me down for a little chat from a very young age and say, how's life going? And how are things going with the Lord? And no one ever asked me that. But it made me stop and think, and actually in anticipation of it, it made me stop and think, I've got to come up with a good answer for Gran. But these questions, why are you crestfallen? Why are you hiding? Who are you hiding from? What's it doing to you to do this? This kind of question, to give space, a walk with God, hearing and not just pushing those things out to the back of our minds. You know, there's a prayer of confession we use sometimes in this, where it says, where in the prayer of confession it says, we ask God for forgiveness because we have pushed to the back of our minds the questions that trouble us. And sometimes God comes with troubling questions. We've not found time to face the emotions that disturb us. We have hidden from life behind habit, activity, and entertainment. We have avoided you, God, even as you came after us. God comes walking with awkward questions and expects and asks and invites us to give some time to the answers. This goes on, doesn't it, in the New Testament? The disciples walk with Jesus. They are following Jesus. They are walking with him, and he will stop sometimes. What were you talking about on the way? We're discussing who was the greatest. Why were you worried about who is the greatest? Is it ambition? Is it an inferiority complex? Is it an overbound sense of competition? Give some time to those questions, because God brings those questions. Does it with Peter on the beach. Do you love me? Do you love me? Peter, of course, was living with a big sense of betrayal. Can I even say I love you? Yes. We all fail. We all drop off. We all do what we wish we hadn't done. And Christ comes to us with those pertinent questions. Do you love me? Enoch was open to the questions. I think that's what the image of walking with God means. Just giving space and time to it. And he's the beginning of a life of faith. We'll come to Abraham, to Moses, to all others who were disturbed by these questions and gave their own answers. But we notice in Enoch that he was open to the questions and to the walk in ways that Adam, Eve, Cain and others weren't. And so he is celebrated as someone who walked with God. And of course he would have brought all of his own questions as well, issues to God over a lifetime. In the bad times and in the hard times, to not have buried them deeply like Cain did, to not have stewed on them bitterly. Or maybe as well as stewing on them bitterly, to bring them out in a walk of faith. Why, God? Why have you forsaken me? You would have been in good company in that question. Where were you when I needed you? Like Job probably couldn't walk much, but he could do the questioning, and he would direct his questions directly to God. He did not quit the field of faith in the tough times, and he didn't become superficial about it. He brought it all to God and to other people of faith. He wanted some answers and was restored in the process. A bit like the people on the walk to Emmaus. What did they met with Jesus. They weren't expecting to. And they start with this really telling comment. We had hoped. We had hoped. And they go on. But how hope peters out. But in the walk with God can be restored, can be renewed. And they start that question walking along, walking away from things to do with faith. But confess in the walk. We had hoped, and we're not hoping anymore. They meet with Jesus, they're restored, and they are hoping again. So it's the walk of faith. It just means doing all of these things with God. Not ignoring it, not pushing it to one side. What Enoch probably discovered going on, and we'll look at this in the coming weeks, so that becomes a walk not just with God, but a walk in God, because Jesus said, I am the way. It's walking in me. We're learning to walk in a particular way, loving mercy, doing justly. Paul would put it differently, investing in faith, hope, and love, because these things endure. A way of living that is on the move but puts down roots. And we'll come to that. But I'm sure Enoch would have discovered that. And certainly what we are told in the end is that he discovered this, that it was a walk to God as well, not just with God. It has a very enigmatic phrase, and he was no more. He walked with God, and he was no more because God took him. Who knows what that means? But it gives you a little sense that he was going somewhere. And he was walking along with God. And then God said, oh, it's a long way back. You're closer to my place than yours now. Why don't you come to mine? Whatever that means, I don't know. But it signals something that is picked up later, and that is that we are always walking towards God as well, that our life has a destination, picked up in loads of ways. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forevermore. I'm going somewhere. And in the book of Hebrews, it becomes a big theme, and we'll see it again, about all of those who live by faith. It says, were seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Indeed, God has prepared a city for them. We walk with God and we walk towards God. But the first learning point about faith that we'll pick up on in this chapter 11 about faith, is we've had the definition. Now let's get the metaphor. The metaphor is this, that faith is a long walk with God, a walk that turns out to be a walk of a lifetime as God comes to meet with us and we welcome his company and discover only later that we're also walking home towards God. Amen.